All right, it's another great day. Thanks for listening in. We have a special guest with us today. Dr. Erroll Southers is with us. We're happy to have him on. I'll take a moment to give you a bit of Dr. Southers' background. He's had a great education, USC and also Brown University. He has a good book, Homegrown Violent Extremism, so I encourage you all to go get that. As some of you probably know, he's been interviewed on CNN, NBC, NPR. And then just his work background, from police department to FBI, deputy director of California's Homeland Security, and even nominated by President Obama to be head of TSA. So great, exceptional work history. Dr. Southers, did you have anything to say before we get started?
No, the only thing I'll say is thank you for your very, very gracious introduction. And I would be remiss if I didn't just say that I am where I am because I had two incredible parents who prioritized education. And in addition to them, I stand on the shoulders of giants and I'm able to do some things that I think are making a difference, and I'm humbled by it.
Awesome. All right, let's start off with the first question, Dr. Southers. It seems as if students nowadays I have a political background, but they're not thrilled about going into public service, public life. And you have a political or public service background. So what encouraged you to take that path? And how do you encourage your students to take that path?
Well, I'll answer your first question on what encouraged me. I grew up in New Jersey. I'm going to date myself here in the 60s, been through several riots in different cities, and guilty of nothing more than walking while black as a teenager and being stopped by the police. And one time I had a conversation with my dad about those kinds of interactions, and he said, you can't change the castle from outside the moat. And so I said, all right. And so lo and behold, I became a police officer in Santa Monica, my first stop, because I wanted to be part of the change that I was looking for. And I encourage young progressives. If we had progressives who became police officers, we could probably reduce the risk of incidents of young black and brown men getting killed by the police. Because I will say this without any data supporting me, and I have to say this, I have a saying in my center that goes, without data, you're just somebody with an opinion. So this is just an opinion. You find two things. Number one, black and brown officers are not involved in those kinds of incidents as often as their colleagues. And female officers are not involved in those incidents as much as their colleagues. So there's a reason for that. I don't have the study to prove it. And hopefully one day my center will get funded so we can do that study. But I say that. The second piece I'm going to say is the government that everybody doesn't like is us. We are the government.
Right.
And people need to understand that they get what they vote for or not. And so I often encourage people in that respect to support the government, become part of that government change you want to be. I'm encouraged when I see young people running for office. There may be a minimum age, but if there is, once you pass that, run, change things. And I think that, the reason we flipped states in the last election is because young people understood two things. We can run for office and we can vote. And I think that's very important. And so when I say public service, it's not just about public office, though. It's also about public entities. I mean, with all due respect, when you are in public service, many people are going to be in positions where those jobs, even if I'm looking at the storm right now that we're having in the Southeast, those public servants are working. Right. They're going to be working when good times, bad times, job security, benefits, making a difference to the community, giving back. There's just too many opportunities that in public government and public service that we pass up. And I wish we would take more advantage of that.
Awesome. What are you reading right now?
Oh boy. I'm going to disappoint you because I'm reading things like
essays.
No. It's not that. I'm reading things like the National Strategy for Countering Domestic Terrorism.
That's interesting.
I'm reading things that are pretty contemporary and coming out like within the last 6 months as it relates to the extremist violence space, the national security space, and the police reform space.
Wow.
So I'm reading things like that.
In police reform, what are you reading? That's interesting.
Mostly studies. There are a study that I just read recently on Yale University where officers who get fired and get rehired wind up getting in not just trouble again, but worse trouble.
Wow.
Reading some studies about officers who, officer screening, because the Lewis Registry behind me, in the interest of full disclosure, is an initiative out of our center, the Safe Communities Institute at the Saul Price School of Public Policy. And it's named after John Lewis. The acronym stands for the Law Enforcement Work Inquiry System. And so we are the first national unified database to document officers who've been fired for misconduct in the country. And that's going to be free and available to anybody in the country in October, that they can search names, they can search agencies, they can search offenses, and most importantly, find out if people have been fired and they're still working. So I'm reading things as it relates to police reform. And again, we want to be part of that change, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I come from a discipline in law enforcement where everybody thinks it's about policy. The challenge in law enforcement is not a policy issue. I mean, we jokingly say police departments eat policy for breakfast. The challenges in law enforcement are about a culture, and you can't change the culture unless you change the people. So my contribution to this is we're going to start with officers who get fired. And when they get fired, they should stay fired. And they should not be working again, putting other people in harm's way. And so I'm reading a lot of work that's being done now in that space of officer misconduct, officer terminations, and things like that.
Awesome. I think we're all aware of violence against African Americans during the pandemic right now. But can you speak to some of the issues the Jewish community are facing? I just spoke to Rabbi Black. He's chaplain in the Colorado State Legislature. I spoke with him a little bit about it. So some of the issues the Jewish community and the Asian community are facing in terms of violence.
Barry, I'm glad you're asking this question. We started a link on our site at the Safe Communities Institute called #VirusOfHate.
Huh.
You know, with the last administration essentially vilifying Asian Americans and Jews for being the cause or the source of COVID-19, extremely exacerbated communities that were already being targeted by right-wing extremists and other extremists.
Huh.
We saw an incredible uptick in the Asian American Pacific Islander community. What's really interesting about that is they were happening in really defined spaces like pharmacies, big box retail stores when people go shopping,
Right.
Incidents where people were they were spraying Asian Americans with disinfectant and assaulting them on public transit. I have a slide that I do in a presentation where in a space of 12 hours between New York and LA, an Asian person was getting accosted on the metro system in both cities at the same time.
Wow.
So we see that. We see Asians being blamed for this. I'm sorry, Jews being blamed for this as part of this Jewish elite that somehow founded this or started this disease. It all falls into the fact that they believe the Jewish government's running the United States. I mean, the Jewish people running the United States government. And then it devolves into QAnon conspiracy theories and things like that. So what we had during this time, Barry, of COVID and stay-at-home orders was, no pun intended, the stay-at-home COVID era became an incubator for all kinds of extremist beliefs to coalesce under this banner of anti-government. And some of the easiest targets during that time were houses of worship. So
Right.
as I've been giving talks before and during COVID, I've given more talks to congregations in AME churches, synagogues, than any place else in the last several years. And what's really troubling is that many of these faith-based communities don't realize that they're being targeted. They don't realize the risks that they're taking, going to their church, going to their synagogue. So we've been trying to make them better educated and more aware of that threat, and also making them aware of some resources that they can tap into for free to reduce the risk of those things happening.
Interesting. I've heard you. That's interesting. I've heard you talk about. I can't recall if it was a CNN interview or you were speaking to an audience at a university, but I recall you talking about ISIS and their recruitment efforts here in America. And I was wondering if that's still going on today, and if so, has it raised during the pandemic or has it lessened?
I'm smiling because that's a story with a somewhat happy ending. I've spent more than 6 years back and forth in the Somali American community in Minneapolis, Minnesota. They are the largest Somali community outside of the country of Somalia.
Okay.
And during the years 2008 through 2010, young men especially were leaving that community to go back to Somalia to fight for al-Shabaab.
Okay.
Well, around 2013, 14 or so, they started leaving Minnesota to go fight in Syria and Iraq for ISIS, which is interesting because you're from Somalia. Why would you fight for a country you have no allegiance to? The ISIS strategy of recruitment became so robust and so effective that they were able to recruit nationalities other than their own to fight for them.
Okay.
They were doing some very unique things. First of all, they had a marketing strategy that was like a Fortune 500 company, online, YouTube videos, website. They did everything Al Qaeda didn't. They were open, out in the open. They had a website. They had marketing tools. They had a place you could go to get information. They told you how to come to Turkey. They told you where to buy uniforms. They told you what you would be doing if you became a fighter. And most importantly, they paid their fighters. So now, last but not least, all the things that Al Qaeda said about how much land they wanted to acquire, ISIS was acquiring land. They had the police departments, they had resources, they had refineries. So what we did is we went to Minneapolis to find out why these young men and women were being enticed to join ISIS. And they were not unlike other men and women around the world who were joining the so-called Islamic State. The biggest and most effective tool in America was to say, you're here now in America. Do you feel like you're being treated right? Do you feel like you're an American? Are they treating you like an American? No, they're treating you like a Muslim. And they don't want you here. We want you in Syria. That's our country. And so that resonated. However, since that time, and the other thing that was really troubling, Barry, is that people were being told, see something, say something. These parents were going to the FBI and seeing something and telling something and saying something and having their kids get arrested and prosecuted and sent to prison for 10 years. So that's not a good strategy for a parent. The Somali American community in Minneapolis decided to take matters into their own hands. And rather than depending on DHS and the FBI and those other organizations, they rallied around themselves. They started running for office. They became entrepreneurs. They started going to college and getting degrees. And now we see business people, attorneys, city officials, school board members, members of Congress. They have totally taken control of their future and their destiny. And they turned off the pipeline to ISIS in the meantime. So to me, it's an incredible success story. They still have challenges, obviously, like any other ethnic minority in this country. But they really are a success with regards to deciding we're going to determine our own fate. We're going to become empowered to take care of ourselves and each other. And that's what they're doing an incredible job of being successful at right now.
We talk about leadership quite a bit on the podcast and books I write, et cetera, et cetera. We talked about this a little earlier before we went live. So I don't know if it's the exact same thing, but you seem so serene and composed. And I'm sure you've had all of these stressful, high tension positions, very stressful. I worked in Congress, it's stressful. So do you have a practice, a weekly or daily practice that you use to stay so centered? I'm sure people want to know whether it's running or tennis or, whatever it is.
Well, you worked in Congress, so first of all, thank you for your service.
Thanks.
I can only imagine how stressful that is, having been to Congress to meet with some of the members and to be able to testify. I had the easy part. I have always balanced my physical fitness with my mental fitness. So every day I work out. In the interest of full disclosure, I used to be quite a bit larger than I am now. I was a competitive bodybuilder for many years. And then I switched over to cycling, and I cycle, and I'm still in the gym. It's almost like a religion. I do that every day. If I travel, I go to a hotel that has a fitness center. I do that every morning. And it balances my mental fitness of being able to read, stay in touch with the things that are going on in my discipline. But it's that physical part that I have to do. Once I do that, I used to tell people, you let me work out in the morning, I'll do anything for you. Just let me get that done. And that's always worked for me. So, it doesn't take much. To me, the sacrifice are those days when I can't do it because I've got a schedule that's just so jammed. But I've always made time for that, either at home or on the road. And it's always served me well.
Awesome. I don't know if you've done a lot of reading in terms of drug use in our country, or if you've done any research on it, but there's such a large amount that comes into our country across our borders. So do you think there are one or two things the leadership, maybe political leadership, could do to sort of slow this down? For example, I was just looking up yesterday, we have a huge opioid problem in America. So what are your thoughts on that?
That's a really challenging issue. And as you say it, Barry, it makes me think about the new Jim Crow as it relates to the war on drugs back in the 70s.
Right.
And the difference between, crack and powder, and the disparity in the sentences and conviction rate that comes up. I don't know how you turn off that pipeline. There's some arguments, at least for certain drugs, obviously, that legalizing them is going to reduce that need or that issue. There are other countries that's their stable export, and it makes a lot of money for them. So I think at that point, the only thing you can do, I kind of always, especially in the counterterrorism world, think about dealing with things at the source. Somehow there needs to perhaps be a State Department effort to stem the tide of that happening. I think once it gets here, it's too late. It's almost like talking to a young person about gangs when they get in high school. That's too late. Yeah. So I would think that we've got to talk about source issues, the countries they're coming from, the export. How do we slow that down? Can we actually affect their supply chain? If you affect their supply chain, you affect the industry. Unfortunately, it may drive up the price on the street, but it's still going to be harder to secure. And at the same time, we've got to treat people who do wind up in these situations as patients and not suspects. I think that's important. It's a disease, and we should stop treating them with a criminal. Everything becomes a nail when you've got a hammer.
Right.
And I see the system as a hammer. I don't see the system as something that's enabling people to move on and get past that addiction. And that's a problem that's always been here in America. There are some programs that do it better than others, but not enough.
Wow. That's an interesting take. I've never heard anybody put it like that. So looking at your background, I think you were head over a number of airports, including LAX, in terms of security. Very impressive. What were 2 or 3 principles in terms of your leadership that guided you during that time? So what was your intention in terms of service?
Well, I'll tell you, for leadership, nobody works for me, they work with me. I believe in that. And I always tell people who work with me a couple of things. First of all, never work for anybody who doesn't want to see you grow and go someplace else. I tell my students that, I tell my coworkers that. If you grow and you've been with me for a while, you're able to go to another organization or position, send me some emails about how much you love it and how much of a difference you're making. That makes me happy. The second part to that is I tell people, always have a mentor. I have 3 of them. You got to have somebody in your life that's going to help guide you. And more importantly, Barry, tell you the truth, even when it hurts. I've had a couple of things I've wanted to do in my career. I've got 3 mentors, and on more than one occasion, they said, Erroll, that's not a good idea. You need to have somebody that's honest with you instead of saying, wow, yeah, that'd be really nice. Maybe you should do that. You need to have people who you can access and who are going to be honest and whose lives you actually want to emulate going forward. And I think that's critical. So, if you don't have any, get one. If you get really lucky, you'll have three, and touch base with them. Ask them that question. There's nothing wrong. My dad used to say, there's nothing wrong with making a mistake. It's when you make the big one. And many of these mistakes can be avoided if you just have a conversation with the right person who gives you some guidance. But that's pretty much my philosophy on leadership and working with people in the organizations I've been with. I never treat anybody like a subordinate. And I'll tell you, even on the law enforcement side, and I took a lot of people to jail, I never disrespected anybody. And so there's a way to deal with people. I love people. I mean, prison for me would be to put me in a cubicle where I can't be with other human beings. I wouldn't do well with that. I love people. So I want to hear from people. I want to, everybody in your organization has an idea. So guess what? If you work with, 100 people and you've only got 6 people in your leadership and they're the 6 you talk to, you're missing out on 94 other opportunities to do something. And they should know they have an equal voice. They should know that you'll listen to their idea. That's how you, if you will, empower people who work with you to do great things because they feel like they can be heard.
I like what you said about helping people grow, and if they grow, they can go someplace else, because I've seen people do the exact opposite in different organizations. They don't want them to grow. So I jotted that down. I made a note of that.
Oh, thank you.
You deal with threats quite a bit in your career. So for someone who runs a business or a nonprofit, they've probably faced financial or cyber threats consistently throughout the year. Is there a system that you all used to use in your work history, or is there a system that you would tell them to implement to sort of safeguard those things?
I'll tell you, obviously there's, God knows, countless consulting firms. In fact, I work with one that you can retain to do that. But I'll tell you what people can do for free. The first thing they need to do is realize that they can be targeted. Many people are in denial. That'll never happen to me. I don't really need to worry about that. The second thing they should do, and it's a methodology we've used before in the firm I'm with, is target yourself. How easy is it for you to compromise your organization? Are your rosters online? What's on your website? People have no idea how much they compromise their organization with their own website.
What do you mean by that?
Everybody's name and email and enough to get a home address or enough to get into some systems. You provide documents. Do you provide diagrams? I mean, everybody wants a website that tells as much about them to the potential client or customer as they can, but you need to be careful about how much you're sharing. And there's no better person to try to hack into an organization or compromise an organization than someone who works there. The biggest threat any organization has is their insider threat.
Right.
They know the organization.
Right.
So we often say, be hard on yourself. If you were going to break into your own organization, physically or virtually, how would you do it? And it's those kinds of conversations and thoughts that people go, oh, wow, I never thought about that. That wouldn't be that hard to do. I know how to do it because I work here, but someone else could figure out how to do that. That's right. A very interesting exercise.
Interesting. I'm going to do that. I'm going to do that for my own. Let's do.
Find out how hard is it for someone to get to you.
Right. Right.
And be hard on yourself. Many people will sit down and go, no, I'm bulletproof. I've got all these systems in place and nobody can. Yes, they can. Yes, they can. You got to start saying, yes, they can.
All right, I'm making notes. Okay, let's do. I always do a lightning round with the guests I speak with. It's for fun, for kicks.
Okay.
It'll be 3 or 4 questions and whatever first comes to mind. So, how many languages do you speak?
Fluently or knowledge of?
Fluently.
1.
And knowledge of?
5.
Oh, interesting. What are they?
Chinese, Hebrew, French, Spanish, and I always include English, so English.
I'm working on my Mandarin, so That's challenging. That's tough.
Enough
Uh,
for me to, greet people, thank people, get directions. Yeah. Because
that's
I go to those countries quite often. So that's why.
Oh, I see. I see. Hobby. Do you have any hobbies?
My hobby is definitely working out, cycling. I just came back from Costa Rica. I take my bike whenever I go to another country. I take my bike if I can. That's my hobby.
Cool. What was the worst part of being an undercover officer?
I did a show on that. There's a show called the History Channel's America Book of Secrets. Have you ever seen
Huh.
that?
I've heard of that. I've heard of that.
America's Book of Secrets. They've got one on the FBI, the SEAL team, Secret Service. I was fortunate enough to be featured in one on the FBI, and they asked me that very question. The toughest part, I spent the majority of my FBI career undercover. The toughest part of that is being alone. You're alone a lot. I
Mm.
wasn't with my real family. I wasn't with my real friends. I was deep undercover, which means I had a contact agent. I couldn't even come in the office. I had an
Wow.
agent that debriefed me. And so you're alone a lot. And that's hard when you've got this, let's just say, real family, as
Right.
in, wife and kids. And then you've got this FBI family. And then you've got this new family you've got because of the undercover operation you're in. And that's who you're
Yeah.
with. And so that's challenging. That's really hard.
Yeah.
You get
I,
good at it. I got good at it. Um,
your mental state. I
yeah,
would just think about my own mental state. Wow. That's a lot to
yeah.
juggle.
It's a lot to juggle, and you become. I'm extremely good at compartmentalizing.
That's good.
Yeah, it's a survival mechanism. If you can do that, you can be undercover.
Wow. That's cool. You worked for LA County Museum of Art, I think so.
Yeah, I
Um,
sure did.
so who's your favorite artist? I'll just put it like that.
Boy, I'm gonna have to say Monet, because we had a lot of French Impressionists at that particular institution. I saw them quite often: Monet, Manet, Degas.
Mhm.
So I would have to say Monet. And my father was an artist, and my son is an artist. I think it skips a generation, and so is my daughter. They all paint. My dad used to paint landscapes and if you will, ponds and meadows like Monet, and so I think that's probably why I was more drawn to it.
Interesting. Interesting. Okay. So that was our lightning round. We got a few more questions before we have to go.
Okay.
I know you're busy. Um, so I'll start here. Identifying a terrorist seems quite difficult since there's no generic profile, basically. So what clues will an individual typically reveal since they can be categorized by, nationality, age, race, etc.?
I got to tell you, I'm always really careful and deliberate about telling people there is no profile
Oh, there is.
for terrorists. There is not.
Oh, there's not.
There is no profile. If you talk to, I have a whole collection of violent extremists who, for all intents and purposes, they fit the definition of terrorism. Some are former neo-Nazis, some are former skinheads. I know a couple of former jihadists. If you talk to 5 of them, they will tell you 5 different ways they got to where they were.
Interesting.
So people need to understand that if I used to say to people, what do they look like? I'd say, stand on a balcony, look at a crowd of people. That's what they look like. What do they have in common? Probably the most common feature is intolerance. Intolerance of another race, religion, gender, ethnicity. Intolerance is always there. Then you'll find that there's some grievance that they tend to place themselves in a position of victimhood. I don't have this job because of him. I don't have this car because of that person. They have more than me, that kind of thing.
Mhm.
There are absolutes, moral absolutes. There's no middle ground with these folks. You look at America now, you're either for us or against us.
Right.
That tends to dominate. Then you get a whole other domain of people who believe in conspiracy theories of a very interesting flavor. And last but not least, to make this more complicated, Barry, when you think you have these trends or patterns or characteristics, you'll find people that I call hybrids, where they will log on to a couple different ideologies that sometimes may even seem counterintuitive.
Mhm.
Like, for example, we have some ethnic minorities who are in largely white supremacist organizations, and that doesn't make any sense, but they're there. Yeah, believe it or not.
Interesting.
And they'll make an exception for that person, and the
Really?
person will make an exception for the group, saying that I'm really with them. It's extremely odd,
Huh.
but to them it works. I'm not going to name any groups because I don't want to give them any fame right now during our interview, but you probably know who I'm talking about when I think about one group
Right.
and their leader, and they'll point to him to suggest that we're not racist, and he'll point to them to say that they're my family, but don't be fooled.
Right.
And that happens more often than you think. If you look at skinheads, there's a whole faction of what they call racist skinheads. Then there's a whole faction of skinheads that look like you and me
Wow.
over in Europe. Yeah, because race is not how they're founded. They're founded as something totally different. So it's really interesting you ask that question. There are no indicators other than some of the characteristics like intolerance, absolutism, otherism, where another race, another religion, and those kinds of things. If you can pick up on that, you're better off than picking up on some physical attribute that makes them lean one way or the other. You're going to probably find out through their statements, their beliefs, and their behaviors.
All right, here's our last one, Dr. Southers. Thank you so much for your time.
Sure, you bet.
In terms of the political realm, because you've been there a bit, what are your thoughts? This one is sort of heated. What are your thoughts on the whole gun control issue? Because it seems to be in the forefront of our society a lot. I think I remember you during a speech, you said that, I don't want to misquote you, but I think you said there were like 87 gun deaths. This was some time ago, a few years ago, 87 gun deaths a day. And I think at one point there were more gun deaths here than in Iraq. I recall. So what are your thoughts on that whole issue?
Well, you're not misquoting me. It's funny you should say that. So you know how I am, like I said in the beginning of our interview, without data, you're somebody with an opinion. So let me give you data. There's 121 civilian held firearms for every 100 citizens in America per capita. The 121 per 100. There's more per capita in America than there are in Yemen.
Wow.
If that gives you a flavor. 40% of the Americans own a lot, who live in a house with a gun in America. 40%. So here's the other interesting thing. And this is why I have faith in Gen Z. I have faith in millennials. I have faith in progressives. Support for gun control over the protection of gun rights in America is highest amongst 18 to 29-year-olds. They want gun control. I come from law enforcement. I have weapons.
Right.
There's no reason why weapons can't be registered. Think about this. Most states in the country, you get a permit, you learn to drive a car. When you pass a test, you get a license. You go down to the sporting goods store and you buy a rifle or shotgun and walk out with no training.
Right.
I used to be a firearms instructor. You have no idea how many trained professionals, e.g. cops, have accidental discharges. Trained professionals. So what about Jane and John Doe,
Right.
who have that weapon in their home, in their nightstand, that they've gone to the range one time 10 years ago with, never cleaned, never practiced, and now they feel threatened? Guess what? If they're lucky, it only gets stolen. If they're not so lucky, they get killed with it. So I'm a huge proponent, like most of my colleagues in law enforcement, for gun control. Gun control doesn't mean you don't need to own weapons. It means that they should be registered. And I got to tell you this, I was on SWAT. I've had weapons that people dream about. Those are not weapons that people need to have in their home.
Right.
Those are weapons of war.
Right.
I thought nothing was more telling than when the Prime Minister of New Zealand, when she decided after the Christchurch massacre to ban assault weapons, and it happened overnight. And that's a country where a lot of people have weapons. They hunt. It's a sport. They agreed, we don't need to have assault rifles. Overnight, done.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. The
So
whole country.
the whole country. No questions asked. One shooting. So I'm a staunch advocate for gun control. And I got to tell you this too. These people who discuss the Second Amendment don't even understand it. The intent of the Second Amendment is not what we have now. And then last but not least, a little bit of history for you as we close.
Cool.
So do you know what the Mulford Act is?
No.
Good. So, we can't carry open carry in California, especially rifles and shotguns. Let me tell you why. In the 1960s, the Black Panther Party did their homework. They, as you know, they were actually called the Black Panther Party for People's Defense. They were founded under the guise of police brutality. Mm-hmm. Black folks were getting brutalized by police in cities across America. And they said, we're not doing that anymore. So what they did in California and doing their homework, they found out that in California, you could carry a loaded rifle or shotgun in public, as long as it wasn't pointed in a threatening direction. Mm-hmm. They said, we're going to police the police in California. They would show up on traffic stops, black leather jackets, berets, rifles, shotguns. And when you got stopped by the police, they'd come up, say to you, we're going to stay here to make sure nothing happens to you. And they would stand there with the weapon pointed at the sky, watching the traffic stop. How intimidating is that, right? Mm-hmm. So an assembly member in California named Mulford, he got together with Governor Reagan because at that time, the FBI and J. Edgar Hoover declared the Black Panther Party a domestic terrorist organization and said, we cannot have that. Behind this banner in my office, Barry, is a photograph I have autographed and a photo with me with Bobby Seale, the co-founder of the Black Panther Party, when Bobby was walking into the Capitol in Sacramento to challenge what was going to be the Mulford Act, which was going to take away the right to carry rifles and shotguns in California. I'll have you know, the Mulford Act passed that day in one afternoon, supported by the National Rifle Association. So we can have gun control depending on who's carrying the guns.
Well, that's a great ending, Dr. Southers. I'm so happy you came on. Thanks for your time. And I'm sure the listeners will enjoy this talk. So thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you. Great questions. And I really appreciate all the work you're doing.
Thank you.